You're in the right place.
Cecilia.
Welcome, thank you. All right, yes,
I'm Cecilia. I'm a master's student here at the Institute of Latin American Studies. My master's is in Latin American Studies. And I'm interested in Brazil because I'm Brazilian born and raised, so I just like to travel all of this.
excellent, pretty good, thank you. Who else is attending the reports for the first time? Yes,
Hi, everybody. I'm Ankit. I'm really interested in Latin America in general. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, but grew up going back and forth between the Texas-Mexico border. And just really interested in democracy and right now what's happening in Brazil, particularly interest. So, yeah, really excited to be here. I'm a master's student in international affairs. So,
fantastic, all right, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sunera and my pronouns are speaker. I'm currently doing my master's in Canadian global thought and I'm interested in all things climate and environmental related stuff and policy. So I was by the way born in Bangladesh. So I think, Brazil is a very interesting place to learn about policy and things like that. And that's why I'm interested in find more. And I'm also doing an internship on the video, so this fits the bill.
Pretty good, thank you, all right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zach. Sorry for being a minute late. I am in the Sustainability Management Program, master's degree there. I'm really interested in international sustainable development and specifically in Latin America. I don't have many ties to Latin America, except that I spent most of the last year there and just really fascinated with the region and everything that goes on. I don't know much about Brazil, but that's why I'm here, excited to learn.
Absolutely. And as the students in the class who are here in the first session know, it's not, of course, an introduction to Brazil, but we use Brazil as a case study to discuss broader issues. And having a background on Brazil is not a precondition, prerequisite for this course. And we have some students who were here last semester who are back in the classroom. Taha, good to hear you.
Very glad to be back, and I'm sorry for being late. Again, I took the class in the first semester, and it was really such a great experience. I didn't know much about Brazil either. I'm originally Lebanese, so those countries have like very close ties, and I really wanted to learn more. And I'm looking forward to what's to come now.
Now that you're a specialist.
Not quite yet. Hopefully by the end of the semester.
All right, Amber, are we online? Amber, can you hear us? So what we tend to do.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm
pretty good.
looking at live streams right now.
Excellent. So you're live. So if you have any parents and any relatives, any friends that would like to join you, listen to the first part of the classroom, and they can log in on the YouTube ELUS channel. And we started doing this during the COVID pandemic, so that as part of the tradition here in Colombia, we used to welcome the community to sessions like this. We couldn't do it in person, so we started doing online. And our sessions are structured in two parts. The first part is a open presentation by a guest speaker. And the second part is a closed session. So we stop the live streaming so we can have a more, we can talk about things that we wouldn't be able to in an open environment. And just preserve you guys, and so you can express freely your positions, your ideas, and also give the speakers the opportunity to also do to express their opinions in a more fluid way. So one thing that I always emphasize is that we operate under Chatham House rules, and that means that you find you're okay to disseminate the knowledge as long as you don't cite the source and the occasion of our discussions. Okay, so any questions about the structure? I'm just repeating this information because we have several new students in the classroom. Right? Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, where's the link to share with people?
Yeah.
On the campus?
So if you can Google ELUS YouTube, then you're gonna see the channel there. It's a little bit long, but I think Google is probably easier. And I just ask you to refrain when we get to the second part, refrain from posting content about the discussion on social media. But this first part, as long as our speaker agrees with, it shouldn't be a problem. So it's a great pleasure to have back in the class Roberto Simon. He's been a speaker in the past year, one of the most popular speakers. So that's one of we tend to do. Like when feedback's positive, we invite some of the distinguished guests back in the classroom. I'm not gonna go over his very extensive resume, but I can tell you that Roberto is one of the foremost specialists and experts on Brazil that highly sought after in Wall Street. Currently works for large financial institution, but previously he was the head of a working group at the American Society Council of Americans that was dealing specifically with corruption, and that's the topic closely related to what we're discussing today. Everybody, I guess, at this point is aware of what happened in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, and that has triggered several conversations, not only in Brazil but all over the world, related to democracy and to what extent democracy in Brazil and the rest of the region is at risk. By the way, tomorrow we have a sequel that was not planned, but I think it's very timely. And there's an event about aftermath of the attacks in Brasilia. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation, the event is going to take place at 5:30 upstairs at room 802. So the fact that we are having this session to provide a background, a context to what happened in Brasilia, we will inform you to that discussion. What I asked Roberto to do is not so much to talk from about specifically about what we expect to happen in Brazil, but more like providing a background of the context so that you understand how we got to the situation. We're going to also be speaking about drawing some parallels between what happened in Brazil on January 8th and what happened here in the US on January 6th, a couple of years ago. And this is something that people are always asking, like, at what extent we see what happened in Brazil as a reflection of what happened here in the States, in particular because there are a lot of parallels between Bolsonaro and Trump. So the point here for the starting point for our conversation is exactly what are the similarities and differences between what we see here and elsewhere. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to have Roberto back in the classroom. Thanks so much, Roberto, for being with us.
It's great to be back with you, Sydney, and classroom. I have to start by apologizing because I had prepared a few slides, nothing too important, but I messed up and sent the wrong deck. So I may have to use this as the Neanderthals used to do with joke. And my purpose here is really to have a conversation rather than just an expose on the the situation in Brazil and the background. So please feel free to ask questions, and we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, right?
So, and one thing that we usually, in order to allow for everyone's participation, but at the same time allow Roberto to present and to make a presentation, is that if you have a burning question about and you'd like some clarifications about Roberto's expose, so to say, feel free to interrupt. Otherwise, I would suggest that you save questions for the second part of our plans.
And so Sydney emailed me with a provocative question, which is democracy in Brazil at risk? Complex question, and got me thinking. I'm going back to a few things. And hopefully by the end of this short presentation, I think you'll have some information on the key topics that I believe are crucial in this debate in Brazil and elsewhere. I do think there are many similarities between what happened January 8th in Brazil and US January 6th, but also that you have a more nuanced view on the situation in Brazil and the challenges that still lay ahead of the country, right? And I think it's very hard to discuss democracy in Brazil being at risk without referring to 1964. So for the Brazilians in the classroom, I imagine that they know why 1964 is such a special year for Brazil in a terrible sense. This was the year that a coup d'etat took place in Brazil and installed Brazil's last military dictatorship, right? Since becoming a republic in Brazil, the military intervened multiple times. Since the late 19th century, it was really in 1964, after a series of indirect or I would say indirect interventions that they really again grabbed power and governed until 1985, right? And this is, I would say it was the last time that Brazil had a coup d'etat, a traditional coup d'etat. One of the slides that I wanted to show, and I'll read it, because it's an interesting chart on, I'll try to replicate here. This, here is the number of coup d'etats, so by the time in the world, right? And you see the chart going something like this. Like here it's the 1960s, year 70s, and then when you reach the 1980s, clearly the trend is going down, and now in the 2000s, coup d'etat are fairly rare, right? It's a rare phenomenon. In the 1960s and 70s across Latin America, had multiple coup d'etat in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina. And but they are, nowadays there's many reasons, including global consensus on the importance of democracy, more mature institutions in emerging countries like Latin America and Africa and so on, that make coup d'etat more rare, right? So we usually, when we talk about democracy at risk, for the first time, we're not talking about the military all of a sudden, taking power or something like that, as we've seen, so those of you who study Brazilian history or Latin American history will see many episodes and a quite important reference for everyone. So the way I would frame the discussion is in a much more subtle way. And I think the book How Democracies Die by Steve Levitsky and Greenblatt can provide an interesting framework for us to think about how you erode the democracy, right? And how instead of having a coup that all of a sudden shuts down a democracy, why do some countries enter a trend where gradually they see, the light of their institutions and their democratic institutions being shut down. And it's a matter of several years instead of all of a sudden. And going back to the parallels between the United States and Brazil, Steve Levitsky and Greenblatt, they wrote this book thinking mostly about Trump in the United States and how the undermining of democracy in this country. But it's interesting how after the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, I believe the book came out in early 2018. Bolsonaro was elected in October 2018. It really, you can see the book in Brazil, accounts. And so, I'll go through some of the points that Levitsky discusses and try to explain how I believe they apply to Brazil, right? One of the things that the authors argue is that typically in this quote-unquote crisis, you have one populist leader that emerges, claiming to represent the true will of the people, the true nationalists, the working people, against elites, right? And to drain the swamp or to stop corruption. Usually, corruption is a big part of the story, or apparently the will to fight corruption. And Brazil experienced, as some of you know, a major anti-corruption operation called Lava Jato that started in 2014, but really took off in 16, 17. So I get my note. It started in 2016 and really took off 17, 18. I'm sorry, and it was really a monumental operation that caught the entire political establishment, right? All big parties in Brazil were involved in this bribery scheme that centered around Petrobras, which is Brazil's main energy company, state-owned energy company. It was really a pervasive corruption scheme affecting everyone, but at the time, the Workers' Party was in charge. And the Workers' Party was directly involved, and many of you know, in the end, the case led to the arrest of President Lula under very controversial circumstances. And his subsequent release, and now last year he was elected president. But anyway, this created this anti-corruption fever, if you will, really mobilized public opinion, reduced trust in democracy, and was channeled by some actors, including Jair Bolsonaro, who claimed to represent, again, the pure heart, the way of doing politics that does not involve corruption. Although he was he was a professional politician, had been in Congress for 30 years, affiliated with parties that were directly involved in the corruption scandal. He made his campaign as someone, an outsider who would change the system once he became president. The second thing, and within Bolsonarism, that Levitsky and Greenblatt point, and I think it's very true in Brazil and to a certain extent, right? It's very true in the United States as well, which is when the president or someone in power stops recognizing his or her opponent as legitimate political forces, and basically the agreement that you have in a democracy that each side respects each other. If you lose an election, too bad, the other side will govern, but they have, legitimate claims, a different view of yours, but you respect the results. Democracy is based on that. And what we've seen in Brazil, and also in the United States, is that the direct attack on opposition as traitors, as people who are evil in the pure sense of the word, and basically not recognizing their legitimacy and their right to hold power and win elections. And by winning election, this is again a crucial similarity between the United States and Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro waged an attack, I would say, for multiple years, even before he was elected president, against Brazil electoral system, trying to discredit the electoral system in Brazil. It was fairly successful in doing so. Here in the United States, you had just fake news about fraud and sometimes isolated case. We even have isolated cases of fraud here. Brazil, I would say that the system is even better than the United States. With multiple international observers, and you don't have a paper ballot. It is unified national. You vote, and the same day you have the results. But Jair Bolsonaro really attacked and tried to prove to the Brazilian public that the system was not trustworthy, and in doing so involved the military. So it was an essential part of his claim to power. And even in the election that he won in 2018, he claimed that it was not 100% free, or was not 100% fair. So you have that in Brazil. Just summarizing what I said, the populist leader, the leader who is going to drain the swamp, the leader that doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the opposition, the leader that tries to undermine the electoral process, and when the opposition wins, does not recognize the victory. In the parallels with the United States are obvious, right? And then in Brazil, you have the fourth element that is not present here, that it's the one that I want to focus attention on, because I do think if you want to understand Brazil now, or understand what happened over the past 4 years, you need to really understand this point, is the involvement of the military in politics, right? Or if I would say a distortion of civil-military relations, right? Under what the Constitution happens. Here in the United States, it was clear multiple occasions that the military would not follow Trump's lead in trying to overturn the elections or make the military a partisan institution or anything like that, right? Whereas in Brazil, what we had was in many ways the opposite, right? Can I show it? One slide I want to show is showing how, Bolsonaro was elected. So basically, Bolsonaro, so for the parentheses, for those who don't know, Bolsonaro, he was elected first as a member of the city council in Rio, and then after a few years, he joined Congress in Brasília, Federal Congress. He's a former military, retired captain, and he basically, and it's a ironic situation. He was kicked out of the military. He was involved in a conspiracy to explode bombs, trying to campaign for better salaries for lower ranking officials and others. But then once he was in Congress, he started really being a vocal defender of, soldiers in general, military or policemen, firefighters, etc., for better salaries. It's a very radical guy. Was really at the fringe of Brazilian politics, who really was, I would say, one of perhaps the only voice that openly defended the Brazilian military dictatorship that I was referring to from 64 to 85, that called for a civil war in Brazil that would kill 30,000 people, according to him. The 1990s would say things like that. And gradually he went back to the fold in the sense that the military, the generals first kicked him out of the armed forces. He was literally prohibited of entering military installations. But because he was campaigning so much and supporting all of the military agenda in Congress for so many years, there was this rapprochement again between Bolsonaro and the military. And by the time that he launched his campaign, he was really representing the interests of many conservatives in Brazil, but also military. And you put this guy as an anti-establishment politician, doesn't have a real party, a real organic party, and he wins an election in Brazil. Go into the details, but basically, if you win an election, you have to appoint thousands of people to positions in the federal bureaucracy, right? So he used the military to do that. Not only the military, but also state police and other groups like firefighters, to do everything from work in education policy or deal with indigenous communities. Or energy policy, etc. What this chart shows, so this is the last president of Brazil's military regime. So here you have the number of military, it's like dark green is the total number of cabinet ministers, right? So here basically under Ernesto Geisel, we're going to talk about him shortly, but under him, there's like 10 military for 22 cabinet officials, so 45% ratio there. So what happened was, when here's Brazil's first civilian government after 20 plus years of dictatorship, right? You see a sharp decline, then this ratio goes up because the number of cabinet members decreases, but when you see the absolute numbers, it goes from 7 to 4, and then 5, then decreases to 1. So basically, as Brazilian democracy consolidated, the number of military ministerial positions decreased to 1, which was usually the head of the security agency, or the main military aide to the president, right? And one important point is here when the Ministry of Defense is created, right? Basically, there's a decision not to appoint a military, including a retired military, to head the ministry, so that the civilian control of the military would be consolidated and would become permanent, which was, as we're going to discuss, never really happened in Brazil, right? When Bolsonaro takes over, basically the number of military in government increases quite dramatically, right? It goes from 1 to 7. But what is more important is that, as I was saying, the Minister of Energy is become retired admiral. The second, the head of the board of Petrobras, the energy police of military, populates a big chunk of the first echelon, but most of all the second echelon and third echelon of government with military, right? And all of a sudden you have this strange shock, right? When the military seemed to be fairly aligned with Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro has a military base, which is completely unprecedented and something that, it's not supposed to happen in a healthy democracy, right? And just going back to this slide, this is really, you don't have to read all of this. It's a crash course on Brazilian history over the past 50 years. But basically, the point that I want to make is that, so if you're interested in Latin America and beyond, Brazil is a very strange case when you think about how an authoritarian regime ended, right? Because basically what happened in Brazil is that the generals who were in control, they decided unilaterally to end the regime, right? And to pass the baton to civilians. And this is, we're dividing in 3 phases here. This started happening in the mid-1970s, right? So in 1974, this guy, Ernesto Geisel, comes in and he says, okay, the military have been in government for 10 years, since 1964. Brazil is growing exponentially, was growing fast. It was the China of those years. It was the country that with the highest growth rate in the world. They had decimated the opposition, and the military were increasingly involved in politics, and part of the generals thought like this is not good. This is going to end badly for the armed forces. So what we're going to do is, in this position of force, we're going to organize a transition back to a civilian government. It didn't mean necessarily a transition to democracy necessarily, but we're going to control the situation and put the generals and the military back in the barracks, right? So he starts that. Then the last general, President General Figueiredo, continues this process, but basically for a number of reasons, including that crisis and several political events, Figueiredo fails to really control this transition, and in the end, one of the leading voices against the military dictatorship, but a very moderate candidate, Neves, becomes president. Brazil's full of drama. He has a heart attack even before becoming president. So Sarney is really the first civilian president after 20 plus years of dictatorship. And then the big question is, how we view the democracy now, and what will the military have, right? The question on how we view the democracy, first big response was enacting a constitutional assembly and writing a new constitution, right? That was really enacted in 1988, and found a place for the military in government. However, the military, although they had left power, they remained highly influential, and they were able to really shape the constitution when it comes to matters that interest them, including, and this is very technical, but basically the ability for them to be involved in rule of law matters, or most specifically maintaining order in situations of crisis. In other words, they had a window of opportunity on certain occasion to get involved in security matters, not only defense matters, right? Which is very unusual for most democracies in the world. Brazilian constitution still has this provision. If the president wants to involve the military, or if any power wants to involve the military with the authorization of the president, that's the way the Supreme Court currently understands the situation, they can do so, right? The Supreme Court, again, very technical, but I think it's important for us. The Supreme Court recently explained what they meant by that. It's not like, anyone the head of the Congress or the head of the Supreme Court, or the president can just call the military to intervene or put the military as the moderator of all conflicts in Brazil, right? Is what I was saying. Basically, in a situation, a national emergency, there's a security emergency in Rio, and then the president at the time decided to involve the military. But for many military and many people in Brazil, there is this interpretation that no, actually, the Constitution says that the military can serve as some sort of referee still in Brazil, right? And this is what Bolsonaro was saying. That if there is a crisis, the military will be involved, and this is my army, my armed forces. So it's kind of explaining the level of the risk. But going back, so we were discussing, this is when we started dismantling the dictatorship, how we started building a new democracy from scratch, right? There were also efforts to dismantle this authoritarian apparatus, right, including the security services that were involved in human rights violations. Brazil also dismantled its nuclear program that was under the military, and Brazil is one of the very few countries, if not the only country, that bans a nuclear bomb in its constitution, right? Brazil has a nuclear program that is solely for civilian purposes, but this was done in the context of getting rid of the authoritarian apparatus of the military dictatorship. And again, by the mid to late 1990s, Brazil creates the Ministry of Defense, trying to put the genie back in the box and say, this is the way it should be. The military should be under civilian rule, right? Under the authority of the president. Then phase 3 is when things start getting out of control in terms of civil military relations, even before Bolsonaro came to power, right? Brazil went to become the lead in the peacekeeping operation in Haiti at the beginning of Lula's administration. So I believe it was 2004, 2005, and basically Brazil was the head of the military component of MINUSTA, which was the UN peacekeeping force in Haiti, and Brazil had the largest number of soldiers there. And this is when the military starts becoming more and more involved with policing and security issues, right? For the first time, I would say, since the end of the military dictatorship. Many of the lessons learned in Haiti were implemented in places like Rio de Janeiro, where the military intervened at the request of the president later on. There was a notion that actually now the military is trained to do police work in Brazil, and they have the equipment to do so. This was number one, I think, when things started shaking. The second part was the Truth Commission that was installed by Dilma Rousseff. Basically, unlike what happened in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, because Brazil had this gradual dismantling of the dictatorship, you didn't have a Truth Commission investigating human rights violations. Also, and I think it's right to say that the scale of violence during the military dictatorship in Brazil was not as dramatic as it was in Argentina, Chile, or Uruguay. That's not to say, one person tortured is too many, right? But the scale of violence in Argentina, for instance, was much bigger. So once the dictatorship collapsed, there was an increased pressure to probe the crimes of the past, right? In Brazil, it was much more of an agreement. You had, again, a gradual dismantling of the dictatorship. You had an amnesty law that allowed for the opposition, including people who were involved in guerrilla activity, for instance, go back to Brazil, even before the regime had ended. Brazil remade its political, but it was a much more complex transition, right? But then you jump to 2012, I believe, 2011, I have to go back and see the dates, but basically the 2010s. Brazil installs this this Truth Commission to investigate the military dictatorships. Human rights violation. The purpose was that, although there was some discussion about the scope of the commission, And the military get really mad about it, because even the new generation of military who didn't, they were junior officers under the leadership at that. They would come back to power with Bolsonaro, but they were junior officers. The military as an institution still claimed that actually, they had saved the country from communism in 1964. And just saying about this, the claims of torture were highly exaggerated, etc. Which was, these claims are obviously false. So all this happened under the Workers' Party, and then as I was saying, in the Lava Jato case, the corruption probe, the military, there was a perception among the military that the Workers' Party was really the source of all evils, the source of corruption in Brazil, and anything but the Workers' Party was kind of the best solution for the country, right? So in 2018, when Bolsonaro was elected, second round, the runoff of the election was Bolsonaro against the candidate of the Workers' Party, was now the Minister of Finance in Brazil. And basically the military all supported Bolsonaro. But it was already, even before that, started campaigning within military installations when he announced his intention to run for president. So I made this big introduction, and I wanted to call attention to it. We discussed the similarities with the United States, right? And how in many ways Bolsonaro and Trump resemble each other. And they not only resemble each other, but what you had in Brazil is Bolsonaros really copy the recipe that Trump developed here, and establishing contacts with people like Steve Bannon, members of the Trump family, and so on. And we discussed the similarities, we discussed what I think is the main difference, which is the role of the military, and which will continue to be a key topic of discussion in Brazil. And then, you have this trajectory, right? The erosion of democracy, tension with the military, and I think we saw two really important developments. The first was January 8th, when a mob stormed Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace in Brazil, much like what happened in the United States in January 6, 2020, and January 6, 2021. Yeah, 2021. But this was part of the problem. I think it was the problem that has similarities with the United States. Regarding the military, the key date is actually when the federal police investigating the events of January 8th, they raid the house of the justice minister and find a plan to overturn the election that would involve basically creating a military commission, putting the military back, at least some of them back in charge, to stop the elections. And what we're seeing since President Lula's inauguration is a series of mini crises involving the military, right? We can discuss that in greater detail, but I think in terms of institutional tensions or the tensions between institutions in Brazil and the functioning of democracy, right? With the election of Lula, I'm not saying if it's a good or bad politician, because with the election of Lula, the first part of the problem, I think, has been, the severity is dramatically reduced, although we still have part of the political establishment in Brazil aligned with Bolsonaro that have all those problems on. And then Russia, now that was discussing, not recognizing the legitimacy of the other, and preaching violence all the time, and so on. But when it comes to the military, it's kind of remains to be seen, right? To what extent we'll see civilian control of the military really represent understanding their role under the Constitution. And also you have a situation, I think, much like World War I, and everything is a strange parallel, but I think it's useful. World War One is a story about countries that didn't want to go to war, but they ended up doing certain things that led them to war, right? And I think the situation now between the new government, the military, many similarities, right? I don't think the military wants surprises with Lula doesn't want surprises with the military, but things can get out of hand, particularly if you see several generals challenging, openly challenging Lula's action. I'll stop here and you have a question.
Fantastic, Martin. I think that's a great way to start a conversation, right? Providing this historical overview and offering us a background to understand the current situation. Let's go back a little bit to the car wash operation like that you alluded to. Just to put things in context, car wash was the biggest corruption scandal in the history of humanity. We cannot overstate that because it has had implications not only in Brazil, but in the rest of Latin America. For those of you who know how have been following what's going on in Peru, the country is still suffering a lot as a consequence of car wash. So do you think that in a way, because Lula had been directly involved in car wash and got he spent time in prison, there was very explicit resentment that might create even there's an unfinished story here that might lead to a crisis that what you're saying about the military, but extend that nobody wants to go into conflict, but this might fuel this potential war, so to say, between the current establishment and the previous establishment.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. So basically car wash, when I say effective, basically, most of the Senate, Senate at the time was involved in car wash, or lower house was involved in car wash. And I think it is important to make a distinction between the rhetoric of the fight against corruption and the conditions that improve the rule of law, right? It's something that I've spent quite some time researching. And usually the anti-corruption rhetoric, I think it's very dangerous for democracy, right? It easily leads to an anti-establishment discourse and the undermining of confidence in democracy and say, okay, everyone's corrupt, this will never work. Why don't we have a military? And on top of everything in Brazil, there's a general perception that under the military regime, or that the military regime was not corrupt, right? Which is basically not true. It's false. So the tension that I see is that under the Bolsonaro administration, what happened was that basically you had a candidate that made a campaign saying the other side is evil, is corrupt, etc. He brought in the hero of Lava Jato, which was Sérgio Moro, was the judge, presided over the first phase of Lava Jato, Curitiba. He became Bolsonaro's justice minister, and he had sent Lula to jail. Lula was Bolsonaro's main opponent, right? And after sending him to jail, he became Bolsonaro's justice minister. And while he was minister, Bolsonaro directly undermine enforcement agencies, right? Including for the first time appointing an attorney general for political allegiance since the beginning of the Fernando Cardoso era, but intervening directly in the federal police. So basically what I'm saying is that the guy weaponized the discourse of fight against corruption and started attacking this environment that Brazil had quite successfully built that allowed for car wash to emerge in the first place, right? Basically, you can't create a successful anti-corruption operation, or you cannot fight corruption unless you have not one thing, but a series of things, right? A strong democracy, freedom of the press, investigative journalism, courts that have independence and the autonomy to the technical capability to investigate things with prosecutors who are not partisan, etc., etc. Federal police that is also truly independent and so on and so forth. So we've seen this environment flourish, I would say, since the 1990s until the end of the Workers' Party government, which is quite, the big irony. And it came under attack by Bolsonaro, right? If you talk to, members of the anti-corruption community, so to speak, in Brazil, they were all shocked by, I wouldn't say shocked, but they were all, very much, very, very critical of Bolsonaro from the outset, right? So where do we stand now? I do think it's a really critical question, right? Lula will have to appoint an attorney general, right? Will he appoint a guy because this guy is aligned with the Workers' Party or not, like Bolsonaro did? What is he doing vis-a-vis the federal police? Will he try to intervene with the federal police? Will he try to pack courts and have his lawmakers or his supporters in Congress, undermine the independence of the judicial system? I think the answer to all these questions is no. I think, and by the way, we had 80 years of Lula and 6 years of his successor from the Workers' Party showing that, no, they didn't do that, right? And there's no indication that they will do it. And I don't think they have the political power to do it, even if they want to do it, right? So I'm very optimistic about the beginning of the reconstruction of the rule of law in Brazil. There are other big topics, including the role that the Supreme Court plays in Brazil right now, which has, it's not a new discussion, but, encourage you guys to read, most recent pieces on the New York Times, for instance, where there's one Supreme Court justice who has been very active in going after people who were behind the invasion of Congress presidential ballots in the Supreme Court, including those that financed the mob that went there, also those that incited the mob, and those who failed to do their duty in protecting Brazil, right? So basically, the guy destituted the governor of the capital. It's a federal district like Washington, D.C., right? But it has the status of the state. He was basically removed from office by the Supreme Court justice. When we say by the Supreme, that's what we read in the media, but actually, the full court supports that. Maybe not 100%, but the majority support that. Which it's never really explained in the media here in the United States or even in Brazil. But it's also to say that for the past several years, the Supreme Court has become more and more active on policy issues, right? Which is terrible, right? And I think this is happening because of the erosion of Brazil's political establishment, as we were discussing before 11 of Congress not doing what it should do, and so on. It is also a threat to democracy, right? In many ways, but I don't think it's a direct threat that is being, portrayed by some people, including Bolsonaro, that this justice is going after people because of what they think is.
Pretty good. And before we enter the Q&A phase of our discussion, can you comment on the implications for the rest of Latin America? And so we see that other countries in the region are they are facing their own challenges to democracy. Yeah. And can we expect similar reactions in countries that somehow have been looking to Brazil as source of disruption, same way that happened with the car wash in the past?
Yeah. But I don't think it's, because of Brazil, things will change in, say, Argentina's upcoming elections or Mexico, whatever, right? But I do think we've seen, trends across Latin America. It makes sense to look at the region through those lenses. Clearly, there is, on the second lost decade in Latin America, where we're seeing basically no growth. After some very positive years for the region that reduced everything from poverty, literacy, increase, all health indicators, education indicators, we're seeing a deterioration on all fronts, right? And one would expect that this reflects on political behavior and particularly support for democracy. And when we look at the polling numbers, we see that support of democracy is declining across the region. Not sharply, but steadily for some time. Why? For many reasons. Anti-establishment sentiments fueled by corruption, but also I would say that promises that were made in terms of development, right? For a new middle class that thought that the country, those countries will continue to grow and new opportunities will arise, and this never truly happened. I think now, maybe a family member can go to the university, but it's still facing all sorts of challenges. The infrastructure is still not there, like public services are not there. So I think it generates a general sense of frustration. So this is common across say different countries, but when you mentioned Peru, I think Peru has very unique circumstances related to its political system, right? And this semi-presidential system, plus not having real political parties. It's a very complex situation, and always the risk of electing an anti-establishment figure that promises to solve everything, and in the end, just undermines democracy and economic growth as well, right? As we've seen in Chile. I think that would be the main lesson. And it's interesting that now we have a new batch of leftist leaders in Latin America. So Brazil, Argentina now, Roberto, Colombia elected for the first time a leftist president, Mexico, and one who debated not just truly a leftist, but still, and they were elected a few years ago. Latin America was really, we had the center right and the right in power, right? Far right in the case of Brazil. Why is that? I think there's a very strong sentiment of anti-incumbency, right? It's very hard for presidents to be re-elected or to elect successors, right? But also I think in the context of COVID and lack of growth, etc., the agenda that the left proposes becomes much more attractive, right? In terms of protecting, or promoting healthcare, education, etc. So I would say it's the combination of this. It's not just anti-incumbency, but also a new understanding of the role of government, particularly after COVID, I think. Now, I think the big election, the coming election is Argentina. We'll see. Argentina experts say it's, the left is unlikely to win, but on the other side, there is no clear, candidate with a strong advantage also. So we'll see where the candidate goes there.
Okay, Amber, we can stop the transmission now. So we are entering the second part of our class with a Q&A session.
Do you want me to continue the recording for the Zoom and end the live stream, or just end both?
Yeah, we can end both.
Okay, sounds good.
Great, thanks a lot. Right, everyone. So I hope